just heathen, but really just people, people in general, honestly, that don't have solid reasons for believing what they believe. They might have like a vague, cliche understanding. It's like they haven't even really thought about why they believe what they believe. They'll run into heathens, and you kind of see this a lot. So they've decided to become heathen. And I did this too in the beginning. Like I was talking about in my Why Also True / Heathenry video, you feel like you have a connection to it. So some part of you, some visceral, deep down part of you relates to this. So you have that connection. And then when you're a wee baby heathen and you're just studying this, you tend to ask what you should believe, feeling like you need to believe in a literal interpretation of the gods, or feeling like if you don't, you're a bad heathen, right? So rather than question things and try to figure out why you believe certain things, you might just attach yourself to these beliefs, and over time you have this like emotional attachment, right? So this like emotional agenda to these beliefs because you want them to be true. And there's nothing wrong with wanting something to be true. The problem is if we don't delve deep enough to understand things, then we're never really gonna grow. We're never gonna become better. We aren't going to understand ourselves as well as we could. So I think it's really, really important to question everything. And I really do mean everything. You should always know why you have certain reasons for doing things, right? I remember this one time when I was in the Marine Corps, our first sergeant was a former drill instructor. This is right before he deployed to Iraq. He was having us march, something that, you do in boot camp, right? You hardly ever really do it in earnest anyway. We're out in the fleet, unless it's, you form up, there's certain things, but for the most part, we don't really march. It was a little unusual, but he was a drill instructor and they love marching. So there was a female Marine who I deployed with that actually asked why we march. And I started going into an explanation of the phalanx and how we're able to like move better as a unit, because this is stuff I had thought about. And rather than listen to me, even because she asked a freaking question, right? She literally turned away and just started having another conversation with somebody else. So rather than have the question answered with information, she turned away. It's just kind of a roundabout way of saying, don't be that person. Question everything. Try to understand why we do certain things. It's my place as a Gothi of my kindred not to preach. It's my place to teach. I'm not a preacher, I'm a teacher. Unintentionally rhymes, but seems like a good motto. Obviously every kindred doesn't have a Gothi. Sometimes it's just whoever's gonna watch my What is a Gothi video. I'm planning on doing a more updated version of that at some point, because that was my first video and horribly edited. If you can't get through it, it's understandable. It's really important to let people grow, which I've gone over in other videos, talking about frith, that communal relationship, and just allowing people to grow on their own, not dictating to them. But at the same time, we should all engage in recourse and understanding. A little bit about how I got to where I'm at as far as my understanding. If you're unaware, I don't have a literal interpretation of the gods. I have a more nuanced understanding that there are certain primeval forces that we as a species have to define and name, and from the various different perceptions in the world, we might see those things as different. I might see the aspect of love as Freya, whereas somebody in India or somebody that feels drawn toward Hinduism may see that same force as Lakshmi, or somebody with a more Middle Eastern draw may see it as Ishtar or Inanna. I've in previous videos given the example of Thor and Perun, huge similarities. Same thing with Indra in the Hindu. These all seem to be the same deity, just with a different perception. So these are the same archetypes, these are the same primeval forces. We just define them differently based on our psychological perceptions. So while I do believe in a spiritual force, I do not bet on a spiritual force, and I understand that the psychological aspect is much more important. So how I got to that point, I've talked a little bit about my wife. She's an atheist and grew up fundamentally Christian, heavy religious influence. Because of that, she's kind of had a love-hate relationship with religion, and in the past few years has been, I think since a little while before she even met me, has been trying to figure out what that means to her. So she made me start to question things. She kept, saying like, well, why do you believe? What do you believe? Do you believe in literal gods? There are gods, there isn't a god. It's an either or. And that made me start thinking and kind of delving deeper. Well, at the same time, during at the end of one of the holidays, I can't remember which one, the kindred had a little sit down and we kind of aired our grievances a little bit. And one of the things that came up, because I asked, what should I do better as a goalie? What should I do better? One of the things they wanted was for me to delve more into the esoteric. It's no secret that I worked a crap ton the past 3.5 years since I've been up here in Humboldt. I could go into a slew about that. When I first got up here, I went from a minimum wage job to having 2 minimum wage jobs, and then a new company took over one of the jobs, and all of a sudden I had a part-time job and a full-time job, and then that full-time job I became a supervisor, and then I did hospital security for about 1.5 years, and anyway, long story short, all this stuff was just a big time suck. I was super tired, not able to put a whole lot of effort into it. It's just insanely monotone. I'm trying to do goathy stuff. I'm trying to work. I'm stretching myself really thin. They felt that I needed to bring more of an esoteric understanding to the table and bring up my beliefs more. On the one side, I got Kat getting me to question my beliefs, and the other side, I've got the kindred asking me to show more of my spiritual side. While I'm attempting to explore this, I was actually working at the hospital at the time and largely driving a shuttle back and forth. One of the things I would do is I would play YouTube and set my phone on my lap, obviously not touch it because I'm driving, just let things play, and then if I had people to pick up for the shuttle, because we were going from a general hospital to Maine, I would pause the video, just be listening to these videos all day. One of the videos was a guy who has had a large influence on me. I'll put a link to his channel in the description, but he is pretty interesting. His name is Michael William Denny. His channel is called Thunder Wizard, and I found him years ago. He's got a very interesting perspective. He doesn't really consider himself heathen per se. Definitely doesn't consider himself also true. He considers himself more of a Teutonic Nordic shaman. He's got a lot of really interesting things to say. I highly recommend the channel. I actually did a doodle that I sent to him that I believe he still uses sometimes in his intros for his live streams. I was watching him. He goes into pretty interesting depth to things. He's got a very interesting understanding of things, and he kind of correlated things to a lot of the Hindu mythology. And then another one of the channels that strongly influenced me, not heathen at all, though he did go through like a Viking series. This one tends to be a bit darker, and every single video he's kind of plugging whatever he's selling at that moment, which take that for what it is. But Thunder Wizard selling his services as well. A Koeting, Become a Living God, BALG, which sounds kind of out there, but it was still kind of an interesting channel, a lot of interesting stuff. He's actually got a book on the YouTubes that was pretty interesting. And again, I'll put a link below. But again, this book about his interaction with like a demon. It's a pretty interesting listen, talking about some of the stuff he's gone through. He's had a pretty harsh life, and it seems like he's using a lot of this darker stuff to kind of deal with some of the issues that he's had. He does a lot of like invocation, evocation, and a lot of different magical practices, a lot of typical occult practices. Interesting channel, definitely more into the shadow aspects, which I'll go over more when I do the actual archetype video. And then Thomas Sheridan, he was another big influence on me at this time. So Thomas Sheridan, another occultist, pretty interesting guy. He's really not a big fan of organized religion in general, but definitely not a big fan of Ausatru or any of the really organized heathenry in general. He's kind of a little bit Celtic, a little bit country, a little bit rock and roll. He's a little bit Celtic, a little bit Norse. He kind of talks about a lot of really interesting occulty things. One of the big things that got him famous was, he's Irish, but he was working on Wall Street as a graphic designer. He had noticed a lot of psychopathic behavior. So he's actually got a few books where he kind of explores that and those, I guess you could say, darker psychological aspects. He talks about like avoiding them and stuff like that as well. But something I noticed with all three of these guys was that everything seemed to be psychological. Everything seemed to stem from the human psyche. Like if A Koeting was doing like an invocation or evocation, would like talk about how like one person might see something differently than somebody else. Both Thomas Sheridan and Thunder Wizard have both talked about how the gods were never literal. They were in these archetypal forms, and of course Carl Jung keeps coming up when they're talking about this. So I'm looking in deeper into this. I'm trying to figure it out. A cat trying to just get me to question things, not in any malicious way or anything. She's just trying to get me to think deeper and try to understand why I believe things, right? It was at that point where I just kept noticing the similarities, and I would notice the more psychological aspects. Like Thomas Sheridan, like I guess he used to do stand-up too. I was a graphic artist. He likes to talk a lot about the bards and the jester, how these social commentators, these artists have a certain power that can easily be seen as magic, and does refer to it as that. So really I'm just noticing these patterns of different psychological aspects. It was at that point that I really delved into why do I believe these things the way that I do? What makes me think that Odin would be a literal being? What makes me think that this literal being at some point in time made a woman rise from the dead and talk to her? If you go into both Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, who expands upon Carl Jung's archetype with his hero's journey and all that, Joseph Campbell has an education background, you notice that these motifs, these things are similar. They would always talk about, Proto-Indo-European root and how things kind of started from that. Like, I've always tried to, very little luck, look into the Hittite religion, because most likely that region is where the people that eventually became the Germanic and Norse came from. The Teutonic people probably came from that part of the world. Brought these beliefs and gods with them, and then they changed based on the culture they were in and the values that culture brings based on the need of the environment around you. There's a few pretty blatant similarities in various different deities and beliefs, like Inanna/Ishtar. She has 2 cats. Freya has 2 cats. Well, her cats are lionesses, which makes more sense for that part of the world. And Freya having 2 more like Norwegian forest cats, that makes sense for that region, right? So it was also kind of obvious that there was like this root belief. So you kind of see how my beliefs evolved and how I'm still questioning things. And I try not to just believe for belief's sake. It's pretty easy to explore the lore and look at it and go, okay, what is the lesson in here? What is the symbolism? There's something else I noticed. Prior to actually working at the hospital, I was doing security in a mental health facility, also dealing with the transient population. There's a large mental health factor. Something else that I noticed, actually similar to what Carl Jung had noticed, these people that would have, and I didn't really see their diagnoses or anything because of HIPAA, but I noticed a similar trend in the things they would say and say they were experiencing, and it didn't make sense from a logical standpoint, but I started thinking about it and I was realizing that they were exhibiting dream logic. Like the things they were saying and kind of doing, or maybe, drawing, painting, I realized that might be something that I would see in a dream. It's not a smooth, logical flow. It doesn't really make any sense. But if you were dreaming that thing, you could see how you would jump around from this thing to that thing, and how reality wouldn't really seem that solid, as it doesn't in a dream. The movie depictions of a smooth dream, they're really just plot devices. That's not how people dream, right? And I think that also influenced how I came to my understanding as well. And of course it was corroborated by Carl Jung, who obviously delved into it much deeper than I did, because he was actually a psychologist in a facility and was able to actually talk to these people and come to these conclusions. And so you can see how I got to the point where I'm at now. So let's say a good rule of thumb to heathenry in general. Let's say you're just coming in, right? You're just trying to understand the lore, you just want the basics, you feel really drawn to this spirituality, this path, this really identifies with you, and you want to delve into it deeper. As a rule of thumb, a general 3-step process. 1 is understanding the historical roots of a thing, the lore references, where people might be coming from. Is this Anglo-Saxon? Is this Norse? Does this come from the Icelandic sagas? Is this Saxo-Grammaticus? And a good Gothi should be able to help you through this. Like, a good Gothi will also be a student as well as a teacher. Like, if somebody has a question on something, I'm not gonna guess. I'm going to tell them what I know and probably do a bunch of research. That's the first step, looking stuff up. A second step is how to do the thing. Let's use the example of giving the landvatir, the landwaits, the spirits of the land, their portion of the meal, which is something that my kindred does at the end of blows. As a kindred, what we do is take portions of the meal, and this should be the first portion to symbolize importance of this. And we put it on a plate, and we'll keep it on the altar until the end of the blow. And then at the end of the blow, we grab it. I say my spiel about the landvatir, and then we give the landvatir their portion. So that's the actual practice. Well, then why do we do it? And that is where your deep introspection should come in. Like I said, I'm not a preacher, I'm a teacher. I'm not going to shove a gospel down your throat. I am going to tell you my opinion and discuss it with you. I'm not going to deny evolution and say the world is 6,000 years old. I'm going to discuss things with you, right? What I have come to the conclusion of is that, in the practical sense, giving the land spirits their portion of the meal with the landvatir, giving them their portion, we are showing that the environment is important to us, reminding ourselves that we need to take care of the environment. Like a lot of the times we even add that portion to some kind of mulch or something that's going to be going into the ground to make the ground healthier, or we'll put it next to a tree that we have marked out as sacred, or if there's blackberry bushes next to my house that I'll use when we do ritual at my house. It just reminds us that the land's important and we need to take care of the environment, and highlights that to us. And that was pretty simple. But yeah, that's the important thing. Just trying to figure things out. And if you disagree, talk about it. If you find something that I have said that you disagree with, throw it in the comments. We'll have a discussion. Maybe I'll learn something. I don't want to just teach with this channel. I would also like to learn. I've had a few people comment and we've had some decent discussions. But yeah, feel free to comment. So in summation, question things. Learn why you're doing something. Figure it out. Don't just go through the motions or believe something because you think that's what you need to do. Figure out why. Is there a purpose behind this? I believe I've quoted Bruce Lee's philosophy with Jeet Kune Do, which I believe is highly applicable to life. Take in what is useful and discard what is useless. That's my approach to life. Like I said, that 3-step process, lore and historical knowledge, the actual activity, the rituals we do, the things we do as heathens, the why. And of course, that last part is the most important. Like I said, I apply this to everything I do in my life. Now for some senseless plugging. So obviously my Redbubble and Teespring and my Patreon and my Subscribestar will be in the description below. Disagree, bitches, grab some own complaints, comment, have a discussion a little more in depth about my beliefs when I do the archetype video, which should be coming soon. And after I do the archetype video, I'm actually gonna go over individual gods and kind of where they fit in the archetypal pattern as I see them, and hopefully spark some conversation and get into it. Skull.